There's a session log from Elektra Records dated November 14, 1970, that lists 3 tracks recorded under the heading Morrison, solo, spoken word and vocal. The log gives the studio, the engineer, the start time and end time of the session. It gives the tape real numbers. It does not give titles for the tracks, which was unusual even by the informal documentation standards of that era, because tracks without titles could not be properly archived and retrieved. The log was signed by the engineer, a man named Paul Whitmore, who had worked at Elektra for 4 years and who would later describe the evening of November 14, 1970, in a single sentence in a deposition given in an unrelated legal matter in 1983. It was the most unusual session I ever worked. Paul Whitmore was not a person given to hyperbole. He had worked hundreds of sessions across 4 years. At Elektra had been in the room for recordings that became culturally significant in ways that were not visible while the recording was happening. He was a technician of considerable skill and considerable discretion, the kind of engineer that serious artists requested specifically, because he understood that his role was to capture what was happening rather than to shape it. His description of November 14, 1970 as the most unusual session he ever worked was not a claim he made lightly. It was the most precise language he had available for something that the language of session work was not designed to describe. The 3 tracks on those reels have never been officially released. They have been heard across the 5 decades since the session by approximately 11 people, the number traceable through the chain of custody documentation that attached itself to the tapes as they moved through various stages of legal and archival processing following Jim Morrison's death in July 1971. 11 people who listened to what Jim Morrison recorded alone in a studio on the night of November 14, 1970, and each of whom, for different reasons and with different degrees of deliberateness, did not make the contents widely known. The 11 people comprise Paul Whitmore, the engineer, who heard the recordings in real time as they were made; Bill Siddons, who heard them at some point in the weeks following the session, by his own partial acknowledgement; 3 Elektra Records employees who encountered the tapes in the course of archival work at different points in the 1970s and 1980s; 2 researchers who gained access through the archives controlled listening program in the late 1980s and early 1990s; David Mangrove, who found them in 1988 and published his note in 1991; and 3 individuals whose names and identities are not matters of public record, whose access to the recordings cannot be fully documented, and whose accounts of what they heard have circulated in the informal channels of serious Morrison scholarship without ever finding their way into print. The story of the November 14 session begins not in the studio but in a phone call made earlier that same day, sometime in the early afternoon, between Jim Morrison and his manager Bill Siddons. The call lasted approximately 25 minutes. At the end of it, Siddons said, "Jim told me he was going to the studio that night, not with the band, alone. I asked him what he was working on. He said he wanted to find out what was left when he took everything away." The call itself is not preserved beyond Siddons's partial account, but its outcome is clear. Jim Morrison went to the studio that evening alone, and what he recorded there became one of the most carefully guarded pieces of audio in the history of American rock music. What Jim Morrison meant by everything is not specified in Siddons's account, but the context of November 1970 provides sufficient material for informed interpretation. The Doors had recorded L.A. Woman earlier that month, their 6th studio album, what would turn out to be their final album with Jim as its frontman, recorded in the configuration of a band playing for each other in a rehearsal space rather than a studio, stripped of the production infrastructure that had characterized the middle albums. The recording had gone well. Jim had been present and engaged in ways that those around him had found encouraging, more direct in his delivery, less interested in the performance of a persona and more interested in the song itself. It had looked from the outside like a person finding their way back to something essential. It had also looked from the inside of Jim's own experience like a beginning of something, a direction toward which the solo session on November 14 was the next step. The L.A. Woman sessions had represented, to those who observed them closely, a Jim Morrison who was in the process of becoming something new, or perhaps recovering something old, the distinction between the two being difficult to establish clearly from the outside. He had been drinking less, he had been writing more. He had been showing up to the rehearsal space in Doors' headquarters on Santa Monica Boulevard with the specific quality of engagement that those who worked with him associated with his best creative periods. The quality of someone for whom the work was the primary reality rather than the context in which a performance was occurring. The solo session was not a departure from this trajectory, it was its continuation. It was Jim Morrison deciding that the next thing required a different kind of room. Jim arrived at Elektra Studio on La Cienega Boulevard alone. No band, no management representative, no one from the label. He had booked the studio himself through a direct call to the scheduling office, specifying that he needed the room and an engineer and nothing else. Paul Whitmore was assigned. He later said that Jim arrived at 8 in the evening looking, in his word, ordinary, not the leather jacket, not the stage presence, but a person in ordinary clothes carrying a notebook and a canvas bag. He said hello, he sat up at the microphone, and he asked Whitmore to run the tape without specifying a configuration. He wanted the room's ambient sound captured alongside whatever he recorded. He wanted it to sound, he said, like a room. What Jim Morrison recorded in that room over the following 3 hours is known, to those who have heard it, through descriptions that are themselves incomplete, filtered through the reluctance of people who understood that they were in possession of something that had not been authorized for public consumption. Paul Whitmore's description, given in the 1983 deposition in the context of a question about his professional history, was brief. 3 pieces, different in character, recorded without multiple takes. He didn't correct himself. Whatever came out, he kept. The quality that Whitmore's brief account most insistently communicated was the absence of the usual apparatus of self-management that Jim Morrison brought to recorded performance. The songs, if that is the right word for what was recorded, were not songs in the sense that the Doors' material was songs, structured, produced, shaped for an audience. They were something rawer and more searching, closer in character to the notebooks than to the albums. Whitmore set up 2 microphones, one at the standard vocal position, one positioned to capture the room's ambience. The specific acoustic signature of the La Cienega studio that gave recordings made there a particular quality of space. Jim had asked for this configuration explicitly, which suggested that he had thought about what he wanted to capture before arriving, that the session had been planned with more specificity than the informal booking implied. The ambient microphone was unusual. Most artists wanted the cleanest possible signal, the tightest possible isolation of the voice from the room. Jim wanted the room included. He wanted the sound of the space that held the sound. The first piece, by multiple accounts, was the longest, somewhere between 8 and 12 minutes, their accounts varying. It was primarily spoken word with occasional sung passages, structured loosely around the image of a road, not the mythological American road of the earlier work, not the road as existential frontier, but something more specific and more personal. A particular road, a journey that those who heard it consistently identified as autobiographical in a way that Jim's published poetry had approached but never quite achieved. The second piece was shorter and more musical, closer to a song in the conventional sense, with a melody and something approaching a verse-chorus structure, though the execution was loose and the performance felt exploratory rather than definitive. Its subject, by the accounts available, was time, the experience of being in a moment that you understand, even as you are in it, you will not be able to hold. The third piece was the shortest and the most difficult to describe. Those who heard it used words like prayer and invocation. It was quiet, almost entirely without melody, spoken rather than sung. It ended with a long silence before Jim's voice returned for a final passage that Whitmore described, in the 1983 deposition, as the most honest thing he had ever heard recorded in that studio. At some point during the session, around 11 o'clock in the evening, Paul Whitmore received a phone call in the control room. He took it at the console, where he could see Jim through the glass. Jim was between takes, sitting on the studio floor with his notebook open, writing. The call was from Bill Siddons, and what Siddons said in that call, and what happened in the studio afterward, is the center of a story that has accumulated silence around it for 50 years. The distinction Whitmore was drawing between the songs that the Doors recorded and what Jim recorded on November 14 was the distinction between art made for an audience and art made for itself, between the shaped and the raw, between the finished thing and the thing in the process of becoming. This distinction mattered enormously to Jim Morrison in the period leading up to the session. The private notebooks document it obsessively. The recurring question of what remains when the apparatus of public presentation is removed, when there is no stage and no crowd and no mythology operating, and the only material available is what the person actually is. The November 14 session was Jim Morrison attempting to answer that question in the most direct available form, by recording. Siddons has given 3 public accounts of his call to the studio that night. They are consistent in their broad outline and inconsistent in the specific detail that matters most, what he asked Whitmore to do. In the 1988 interview, Siddons said he called to check in and to let Whitmore know that the session had not been formally approved by the label, which created potential issues with the tape's ownership and distribution. In a 2002 interview, he said that he had called with concerns about Jim's mental and emotional state in the period leading up to the session, and that he had asked Whitmore to be attentive and to call him if anything seemed wrong. In a 2009 interview, he said only that he had called for reasons that were professional rather than personal, and that what he said to Whitmore was a matter he preferred not to discuss in detail. The session log is held in the Elektra Records archive and has been viewed by the handful of researchers who have pursued the session's history with sufficient persistence to gain access. It is a standard session log in every respect except for the absence of track titles and the unusual notation about the ambient microphone configuration. The inconsistency in Siddons's accounts has generated, among those who know the session's history, a sustained interpretive question. What did Bill Siddons say to Paul Whitmore on the phone at 11 o'clock on the night of November 14, 1970, that resulted in what happened next? Because what happened next was that the session ended. Not immediately, Jim recorded the third piece after the phone call, which took another 40 minutes. But at the end of the third piece, Whitmore came into the studio, spoke to Jim briefly, and Jim gathered his notebook and his canvas bag and left the studio without listening to playback, which was his invariable practice when he was satisfied with a recording. He left without reviewing what he had made. And the tapes went into the Elektra archive under a designation that made them practically inaccessible to anyone who did not know to look for them specifically. What Siddons said on that phone call has never been definitively established. The people who know or who might know have not said. Siddons himself, who died in 2021, left the specific content of the call unconfirmed in his public accounts. Whitmore has not spoken publicly about the session beyond the 1983 deposition reference. The 3 accounts are not contradictory in a way that suggests deliberate deception. They are inconsistent in the way that accounts of emotionally complex events are typically inconsistent, the person giving them remembering what served their understanding of themselves at the time of the telling. Siddons was, by all available evidence, a person of genuine integrity who cared about Jim Morrison's well-being. The question of whether his decisions were correct is separate from the question of whether they were made in good faith. Jim Morrison left for Paris in March 1971, 4 months after the November 14 session. He told no one in the period between November and March about the solo recordings, not Ray Manzarek, not John Densmore, not Robbie Krieger, not Pamela Courson, not anyone who would later write or speak about those months in any recoverable form. Session existed in his life, and then he went to Paris, and then he died, and the tapes remained in the archive under their obscuring designation, and the story of what was recorded on them remained in the memory of the 11 people who had heard them, distributed across decades of accumulated silence. Jim Morrison's silence about the session in the 4 months between November 1970 and his departure for Paris is itself a form of evidence. He was not a person who maintained silence about his creative work out of habitual discretion. He talked to Ray Manzarek about the poetry, to John Densmore about the music's direction, to Pamela Courson about what Paris was supposed to make possible. The closest thing to a public statement about the content of the November 14 recordings came in 1991, when a researcher named David Mangrove, who had spent 3 years working on it, Comprehensive discography of Jim Morrison's recorded output, published a brief note in a specialist music journal about his discovery of the session log. The note confirmed the existence of the session, the date, the engineer, the 3 tracks. It did not describe the content of the recordings. It ended with a sentence that those who know the session's history have read as a form of communication in itself. The author has listened to the recordings and considers their contents, in the context of what was known about Jim Morrison's interior life in the final months before his departure for Paris, to be among the most significant undocumented material in the history of American rock music. Mangrove declined all subsequent requests for elaboration. He said, in the one response he gave to the handful of researchers who contacted him after the note's publication, that the recordings were not his to describe, and that he had said in the note what he believed was appropriate to say publicly. He said that anyone who wanted to understand what the recordings contained should spend time with the Paris notebooks, that the November 14 session and the Paris writing were, in his view, continuous with each other, the solo session the last American iteration of the same searching that Paris had continued, and that July 3, 1971 had ended. This was, in retrospect, the form of publication that the material deserved, significant enough to enter the record, quiet enough not to generate pressure on the archive that might have forced a premature decision about the recording's future. Mangrove had understood, in publishing the note and declining to elaborate, that the appropriate relationship to material of this kind was custodial rather than possessive, that his role was to confirm its existence and attest to its significance without appropriating its meaning. The tapes still exist in the Elektra archive. Their legal status, who owns them, who has the right to authorize their release, whether the Morrison estate or the label or some combination of the two holds that authority, is a question that has not been formally resolved, partly because the question has not been formally asked in a context that required an answer. The session's existence is not secret. The session log is a matter of record. What is not available, and what has not been made available across 50 years of the culture's sustained interest in Jim Morrison's life and work, is the sound itself, the 3 pieces recorded on November 14, 1970, by a man who told his manager he wanted to find out what was left when he took everything away. What was left, according to the 11 people who heard it, was the essential thing, the thing that the mythology had been pointing toward without being able to contain, the thing that the public work had been approaching from outside while the private work had always known was inside. What was left was the voice without the performance, the words without the mythology, the person without the persona. What was left when Jim Morrison took everything away in a studio on La Chenega Boulevard on the night of November 14, 1970, was the most complete version of himself that he had ever committed to tape. And then he went to Paris, and then he died, and the tapes remain in the archive under their obscuring designation, carrying that version of him across the decades, present and inaccessible, and waiting for a decision about what to do with them that has not yet been made and may never be made by the people who have the authority to make it, the 3 pieces, the room's ambient sound, the voice without performance, the most honest thing Paul Whitmore ever heard recorded in that studio. What the recordings represent, in the context of Jim Morrison's life as it is knowable from the outside, is the last available evidence of the search for the private self beneath the public one, for the poet beneath the performer, for the voice that existed before the mythology claimed it and that might exist again once the mythology was set aside. The November 14 session was the final American iteration of that search. Paris was its continuation. And July 3, 1971 was the date on which the continuation stopped, permanently, leaving the search at whatever point it had reached when Jim Morrison closed the notebook and lay down and did not get up, still there, still waiting, still the most significant undocumented material in the history of American rock music, if David Mangrove's careful judgment is to be trusted, and there is no reason not to trust his judgment entirely.